Adequate, the Duke of Caromere said, not looking up from his ledger. The children are clean and quiet, and they no longer weep at night. You are adequate, Miss Hale. That is all I require. Rosalind stood very straight in the cold morning light of his study, and let the words settle over her like frost. She had taught his 2 motherless children for 11 months. She had sat through the youngest's fevers and the eldest's nightmares, had taught a boy who had not spoken since his mother's death to laugh again, and she was adequate. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said evenly. "Will that be all?" "That will be all." She curtsied and withdrew, and she did not let her composure crack until the heavy door was closed behind her, and the long stone corridor of Caromere Hall stretched empty before her. Only then did she press her hand flat against the cold wall and breathe. She had not expected warmth. The cold Duke of Caromere was famous for the lack of it. He had buried his wife 3 years past and had buried his heart with her, men said, somewhere in the frozen north wing where no servant was permitted to go. He spoke to no one if he could help it. He took his meals alone. He looked at his own children as though they were a duty assigned by someone he had quarrelled with. But Rosalind had let herself imagine, foolishly, that the long evenings in the library might have meant something, that when he came to listen to her read to the children by the fire, standing silent in the doorway night after night, it was for more than the supervision of a governess. That the single morning he had found her weeping over a letter from home, the morning his late wife's birthday, and had said nothing but had quietly left a cup of warmed wine at her elbow before he went, that this had been a kindness, and not an accident. Adequate. She climbed the stairs to the schoolroom and found the children at the window, and she smiled for them because that was what one did, and she taught them their sums, and inside her something quiet and final had closed. That evening she wrote 2 letters, one to the agency in town, the other to her late father's old friend, a widowed gentleman of means in Bath, who had written to her twice, that year offering her the post of companion to his elderly mother and a wage twice what a governess could earn. She had refused him both times. She did not refuse him now. She gave the Duke a month's notice. She stood in his study again, and she told him plainly that she had accepted another position, and that she would see the children's new governess properly settled before she left. For the first time in 11 months, the cold Duke looked up at her fully. "You are leaving," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Why?" She could have said many things. She could have said the word he had given her back at him, adequate, and let him feel the edge of it. But Rosalind had been raised by a clergyman who taught her that dignity asks no audience and seeks no revenge. "Because I have been offered a position where my work is wanted," she said simply, "and not merely tolerated." Something flickered behind his pale eyes. "The children are attached to you." "I am attached to them. I love them dearly, and I shall grieve to leave them, but they will heal, Your Grace. Children do. I have taught them that." She held his gaze. "I learned to mend rather young myself." He was silent for a long moment. "I will double your wage." "It is not the wage." "Triple it, then. Whatever the Bath gentleman offers, I will exceed it." "You misunderstand me," Rosalind said gently, and she was surprised to find no anger in herself at all, only a great and steadying calm. "I am not negotiating. I am taking my leave. I wish only to do it well." She curtsied. "I shall have everything in order by the month's end." She turned to go. "Miss Hale." She stopped at the door but did not turn around. For the first time she heard the Duke of Caromere sound uncertain. "Was I?" He stopped, started again, and the words came stiff and unpracticed, like a man speaking a language he had forgotten. "Have I given offence?" Rosalind closed her eyes a moment. Then she looked back at him, this proud cold man who did not know how to ask the thing he was asking. "No, Your Grace," she said. "You have given me a fair character and a roof and 11 months' honest employment. You have given no offence. You have simply given nothing else." And she let herself say the rest, quietly, kindly, because she would never see him again, and it seemed a waste to leave it unsaid. "I had hoped, once, that there might be something else. That was my error, not yours. I shall not make it again. Good evening, Your Grace. She left him there in the cold study with the words she had thrown back at him, unspoken but understood between them at last. The month passed. The new governess arrived, a competent older woman, and Rosaline taught her the children's ways, which sums the boy struggled with, which lullaby the girl could not sleep without. On the last morning the children clung to her skirts and wept, and Rosalind held them both and told them she would write, and she would. She kept that promise for years. The Duke did not come to see her go. But as the carriage rolled down the long avenue of elms, Rosalind looked back once at Carrowmere Hall, and she saw a figure standing motionless at an upper window, dark against the glass, watching the carriage until the trees hid it from view. She turned to face forward and did not look again. What she did not see was what came after. She did not see the Duke of Carrowmere remain at that window long after the carriage had gone, until the footman came twice to ask whether he wished his dinner and went away twice unanswered. She did not see him go that night to the empty schoolroom and stand among the small chairs and the slate and the book of fables she had left behind, and pick the book up and put it down again and find that the room without her voice in it was the loudest silence he had ever known. She had told him he had given her nothing, and he had agreed with himself that this was true, and only now, with the giving gone, did he begin to understand the size of what he had refused to give. But Rosalind did not see any of that. She faced forward as she had taught herself to do, and let the elms close behind her like a door. The years moved on. In Bath, Rosalind flourished. The widowed gentleman's mother proved a sharp and delightful old woman who came to love her like a daughter, and the two of them spent 3 happy years together, reading and quarrelling over cards and laughing at the follies of the fashionable. When the old woman died, she left Rosalind a small independence of her own, enough to keep her in modest comfort for the rest of her days, and a great many friends besides, for the widowed gentleman's mother had introduced her everywhere as "my dear Miss Hale, who is worth the whole of Bath put together." Rosalind was no longer anyone's adequate governess then. She was a woman of modest means and considerable accomplishment, sought after as a companion, admired in the drawing-rooms of Bath for her wit and her grace and the quiet steadiness that no unkindness could shake. She took rooms of her own with a window that looked out over the Crescent, and she filled her hours as she pleased, and she discovered that a woman the world had once looked through could, with patience and dignity, teach the world to look at her after all. Gentlemen courted her. There was a respectable physician, and a kindly clergyman, and a retired colonel with a fine laugh. She refused them all gently and could not have said quite why. She heard things, now and then, the way one does, that the Duke of Carrowmere had grown stranger and colder than ever, that he had dismissed 3 governesses in 2 years because the gossips said none of them would do, that his children were sent away to school far younger than was kind, that the cold Duke had withdrawn from society altogether and let the great hall fall into a kind of grand silence, and that some said he had lost his reason, and others said he had merely lost something he could not name. A lady newly come from the north told the story over tea one afternoon, not knowing Rosalind had any part in it. The Duke, she said, had taken to walking the same corridor every evening, the long stone one that led past the schoolroom, and had been heard, by a frightened housemaid, speaking aloud to no one in the empty room where the governess used to read to the children. He had let the gardens go to seed. He answered no invitations. He had become, the lady said with a delicious shudder, quite the most tragic figure in 3 counties, and not a soul knew the cause. Rosalind drank her tea and said nothing, and her face gave away nothing, and only her hands, folded tight in her lap, knew that something long buried had stirred. Rosalind listened to all of it with a still face and a heart she believed long since healed. It was 4 years to the season when she saw him again. She was in the pump room at Bath, in a gown of deep blue silk that became her well, listening to an old friend's account of a wedding, when the room's noise shifted in that particular way that means someone of consequence has entered. She did not turn. She had learned not to turn for such things. Then a voice she had spent 4 years forgetting said, very low, just behind her, "Miss Hale." She turned. The Duke of Caromere stood before her, and the years had not been kind to him. He was thinner. There was grey at his temples that had not been there before, and the cold pride of him had worn down to something raw and unguarded that she had never seen on his face in all her months beneath his roof. He looked at her as a man looks at water after a long thirst. "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied, and was proud that her voice did not shake. "You look well," he said. "You look—" He stopped, as though the ordinary words were failing him again. "You look very well." "Thank you, I am very well." She let a small silence sit. "The children, are they well?" "They ask after you still." His jaw worked. "They have never stopped asking after you. The boy keeps your letters in a box. He reads them when he thinks no one sees." Something turned over in Rosaline's chest. "I am glad my letters reached him. I have always wondered." "Every one." The Duke's hands closed and opened at his sides. "Miss Hale, I came to Bath because I was told you were here. I did not come for the waters. I have no illness the waters can mend." He drew a breath that seemed to cost him a great deal. 4 years ago I called you adequate. I have thought of that word every day since. It has sat in my mouth like a stone. Your Grace. Let me say it. I have rehearsed it on the entire road from Caromere, and if I do not say it now I shall lose my courage, and I have very little left. His pale eyes held hers, and she saw that the cold in them was gone entirely, broken through, like ice over running water. I was a coward. When my wife died I locked every door in myself, and I called it grief, and I let it become a habit. And then you came into my house and the doors began to open against my will, and it frightened me more than anything in my life. I watched you read to my children every night because I could not stay away. And when I felt myself beginning to live again, I was so afraid of it that I called the dearest woman I had ever known adequate, to keep her at arm's length, to keep her from seeing what she had done to me. His voice cracked, the governed coldness of a lifetime breaking apart in the middle of a crowded room. And you walked away, with such grace that I had not even the comfort of blaming you. You walked away and you took the warmth of my whole house with you, and I have lived in the cold ever since, and I deserved it, and I have come 100 miles to tell you so. Rosalind stood very still. The pump room murmured on around them, and the morning light fell through the tall windows onto his ruined, hoping face, and she found that her heart, which she had believed long healed, was not healed at all. It had only been waiting. You called me adequate, she said softly. I lied. I know, she said. I knew it then. That is why it grieved me so. She looked down at her gloved hands, then back at his face. Do you know what the cruelest part of that word was, Your Grace? It was not that it was unkind. I have borne a great deal of unkindness in my life and survived it well enough. It was that it was so plainly untrue, and that you chose it anyway, knowing it was untrue, because a true word would have cost you something you were not willing to pay. I could have forgiven cruelty. It was the cowardice I could not stay to watch. She drew a breath. And yet here you are, 100 miles from home, paying it at last, in the middle of a crowded room, before all these staring strangers. That is not the act of a coward. That is the bravest thing I have ever seen a proud man do. Something moved in his face at that, a kind of wonder, as though she had given him a gift he had not dared to hope for. You have always seen me more clearly than I have seen myself, he said, even when I gave you no cause to be kind. Even when I gave you a single cold word and an empty house and a master who could not bring himself to say good morning. You looked at me, in that study, and you saw not a duke to be feared, but a frightened man to be pitied, and you would not pity me, because you knew pity was not what I needed. You knew it before I did. He shook his head slowly. 4 years I have turned that over. 4 years, and I have only now understood that the woman I let walk down my avenue of elms was the one person alive who might have made me whole, and that I sent her away because I was too great a coward to be mended. He took a step closer. I have no right to ask you anything. You have made a fine life. You owe me nothing but the door I gave you. But I am no longer a duke too proud to beg, Rosalind. I have unlearned that thoroughly, Her name in his mouth was a thing she had never heard before, and it undid her. Come back, not as a governess. I will never again offer you a wage for the warmth you gave my house freely. Come back as my wife. Let me spend whatever years are left to me proving that you were never adequate, that you were everything, that you were the whole of what I could not say. Rosalind looked at him for a long moment, at the grey in his hair and the tremble he could not hide, and the 4 years of cold written into his thinner face. She thought of the carriage rolling down the avenue of elms, of the dark figure at the upper window watching until the trees took it away. She thought of the man who had not known how to ask if he had given offence, who now stood in a public room and begged. You let me leave, she said. You stood at the window and you let me go. It is the greatest mistake of my life. I have spent 4 years inside it. And you sent your children away. His face contracted with shame, because the house was unbearable without the sound of you in it, and I am a fool, and I have sent for them home again. They are at Caromere now. They are waiting to know whether I shall come back alone. He swallowed. I would rather not, Rosalind. I find I would very much rather not. A long breath went out of her. She had walked away with her dignity whole and her head high, and she had built a life that needed no man at all, and she was prouder of that than of anything. And she understood, looking at him, that to go to him now was not to surrender that. It was the freest choice she had ever made by a woman who could have chosen anything, who chose this only because she wished to. I will not be adequate, she said, not ever again, not in your house. No. Something broke open in his face that might have been the beginning of joy. Never. You will be its heart. You always were. The whole house knew it but me. Rosalind reached out, this woman of independence and grace who owed him nothing, and laid her hand in the trembling hand of the cold Duke of Caromere, who was not cold at all, who had only frozen for want of her. Then take me home, she said. There are 2 children who keep my letters in a box, and I find I have missed them very much. The Duke closed his fingers around hers as though she were the only solid thing in a drowning world. And there in the bright public morning, with all of Bath looking on, the proudest man in 3 counties bowed his head over the hand of the governess he had once called adequate, and wept, and was not ashamed, and Rosalind laid her free hand against his bent grey head, and forgave him entirely, because she had loved him all along and had only been waiting, with grace, for him to find the courage to deserve it. They were married before the autumn turned, in the small grey chapel near Caromere, with the children standing up beside them, the boy gravely holding the ring as though the fate of nations depended upon it, the girl scattering the last roses of the year and weeping with joy the entire time. Rosalind wore a gown the colour of the autumn beeches, and she did not feel, walking up the aisle to the man who had once called her adequate, the smallest flicker of the old hurt. It had all been burned away and something far better grown in its place. And in the years that followed, the great cold halls of Caromere grew warm again and stayed warm. The gardens were restored. The empty schoolroom filled once more with the sound of reading by the fire, and the long stone corridor that the Duke had once paced alone he now walked with his wife on his arm. He learned slowly, and then not slowly at all, how to say the things he had spent a lifetime locking away. The Duke, who had once spoken a single careless word to keep love at bay, never spoke another such word, but told his wife so often, and so plainly that she was the whole of his heart, that she would laugh and lay her fingers against his mouth and beg him in mock despair to stop, and he never would. Not once, not for the rest of their long and tender lives.